River Watershed Joint Powers organization. And I would just like to thank you guys all for attending today. And I would like to thank Shane for presenting. Even though you know trees, you don't think of that in connection to a watershed. Trees do play an important part in our watershed. They help with our water quality, our soil quality, and so we figured this is a really good topic to bring to people in the watershed and outside of the watershed. So yeah, we'd like to just thank you guys for attending. Hopefully find it useful. And here's Shane.
All right. Thanks, Emmy. Yeah, so we're going to focus today on trees, and my background is in soil, and but I've been an extension educator in Blue Earth and Sueur County since 2017, and over the course of that time, quite a large amount of the calls that I had gotten at the office and still do get revolve around forestry, whether it's urban forestry, rural forestry, windbreaks. So I've kind of became passionate over trees during that time. So hopefully you'll be able to find some resources here for your own operation. So this kind of is a broad view of what we're going to talk about today in regards of the rewards of growing trees. So we're going to talk a little bit about benefits, of course, but I really want to try to harp on these other two here because we're all fans of trees, and we know if you're probably part of this webinar, you probably are a fan of trees already in some capacity. But we really want to make sure that we're doing the last two of those points because to keep trees on the landscape, we want to make sure that we select the right types of trees, we plant them correctly, and we maintain them. So we'll start right off with the benefits. So my last name is Bugeja. It's a little odd, but my grandparents came from this little island here in Malta. It's a Mediterranean island. It's its own country. It's back in the prehistoric times, it would be full of forests and shrublands, kind of in a Mediterranean climate. And there's a picture over there of Sicily, but that's kind of what it would have looked like back in the day. And over time, people had lived in Malta for thousands of years. So this is some photos I took when I visited Malta. So those are the picture on the left over here. This is a Neolithic temple. So this is a couple thousand years older than the pyramids even. And then there's some Roman ruins over here. So people had lived on this small island for a long, long, long time. And if you can see Malta today, you can see this kind of grayish stuff. That's all really heavily urbanized area. So this country is very, very small, one of the smallest countries in the world, and it's also one of the most densely populated in the world. So when you do that, a lot of that green space becomes removed over time as things start to get developed. So this is Valletta. This is the capital of Malta, and you can really see how few trees that we have here. It's not a lot of green. There is some over across the harbor, but this kind of represents it's a really hot Mediterranean climate, a lot of concrete, a lot of limestone, and a lot of the green space is missing. So if you do have large trees in this area, when they get removed, it's quite the news story. So this is the Times of Malta. This is one of the most popular English language newspapers in Malta, and you can see just within the last year or so, you can see all of these headlines about old trees being removed. Why were these trees uprooted? You know, mature trees cut down, and comments can be in the hundreds. So trees mutilated to accumulate feast decorations. So this is really important in that country. When trees get removed, people get upset, and rightfully so. And just to not give you a terrible impression of the island, there's some other photos I took when I was there. Over here was a very interesting kind of growth. This was near Medina, which is a walled city in Malta. In the middle here, there's some really nice gardens. So when they do decide to have trees in a nice space, they're beautiful. And then on the right here is a caper tree or a caper bush. Do you know like the capers you might find in the grocery store aisle? They kind of grow wild all over in Malta. So I don't want to give you the false impression about the island being a hostile place for trees, but it does affect the population, and it's very important to their well-being. So we use this buzzword ecosystem services, and again, this is basically just saying the benefits of trees in the landscape. Of course, we're very well aware of how Trees can store carbon and take in carbon, release oxygen into our environment. Also very important for stormwater management, erosion, windbreaks, wildlife habitat, dust aerosol removal. Conifers are really good at that. Shade or cooling effects for some of those heat islands. We can, if we know what we're doing and we plant trees and shrubs in the right spots, we can kind of control where snow builds up or snow drifts build up. They're also very useful for odor control. Again, those conifers would be a good type of species for that particular service. And we also have some social and mental benefits of planting trees. Has anybody heard of forest bathing? I just want to see if people in the chat have heard of forest bathing. Yes, a lot of people have been raising their hands. Yes, and it's something that it's a lot of it's almost like a meditation where you're outside and you're just kind of being very mindful of your environment. You're out, you take a lawn chair or something along those lines, put it out into your woodlands and just take in everything. And I've done that once or twice, you know. But we can see this a lot. It's becoming more popular. So this is Virginia's extension service. We also have Michigan State kind of talking about how important being in nature, being in a woodland is to our mental health, especially during, you know, the COVID pandemic. And then we even have resources on our website about during that time where nature was front and center to our mental well-being. And kind of going along these lines of tree benefits. So after this presentation, I'm going to, or I shared with Emmy and Claire, a kind of a resource guide. So a lot of the resources that I'll be talking about in this presentation will be available on that worksheet. So don't worry about all of the links just yet. But one of the fun things that you can do if you're in a residential setting, this would be really a useful tool. The Arbor Day Foundation has this cool little calculator where you'll type in, you know, your tree species and then the diameter. And then you can kind of break down some of these benefits for you to kind of get a ballpark idea of the types of services that tree is providing you. I used an ash tree for this particular case just because we're losing so many of them in my area, and most of I suspect most of the Cannon River area as well. But just, you know, just saying like a decently sized ash can provide $185 of benefits every year. Again, with property values and other types of things, this could be substantially more. One of the other things that we tend to see or hear about is, well, trees, if there's lots of trees in an area or in an urban environment, that will bring in crime. And usually it's the opposite. A lot of research has shown it's quite the opposite. In fact, the more trees and certain greenscape that you have, a lot of times certain types of variables come into play where people might perceive this neighborhood to be healthier, better. People are proud of their environment, and that might correlate with decreases in other types of property or violent crime even. So that's one of the things that a lot of people don't think of or have maybe the wrong impression that having lots of trees in areas would enhance crime when it actually, if anything, it decreases it. Of course, we have other benefits and uses of trees. We're getting ready for the holiday season, so culturally, trees are very important for our holiday season. Of course, hopefully everybody's going out and buying some Minnesota grown Christmas trees. Of course, we have fruit that we deal with and enjoy from our landscape trees, our apples, our cherries, our pears. We can use our wood for firewood too, as well. And then I put this witch hazel here because a lot of times people could use it for medicine or other products. And then I hear, you know, a lot of people might have some black walnuts. And one of the things that you can do with black walnut, as sure as everybody that has messed around with the fruit before, it does tend to stain things, but you can also use that stain to dye fabrics, right? So there are a lot of uses that we can have even in the trees in our landscape here in Minnesota. So next, I really want to, again, I mentioned this earlier, I really want to focus on those last 2 points because if we don't get the proper planting, the tree selection, we don't maintain it, we won't be able to get those benefits and keep them for a long time. So we're going to dive right into it. So I'm going to highlight four tree selection resources that I've used in the past and found each has their kind of pros and cons. And again, this will be on the resource list that we'll send out. So one of the first ones we'll talk about is something called Climate Ready Woodlands. This is mostly through the University of Minnesota Extension, but this is really good if you're looking to future-proof your woodlands as maybe you lose ash trees or other trees start to, if you're looking to restock or rejuvenate your woodlands. This could be a really great resource for you because it takes into account changes of climate in the future. And while it's very native heavy, there might be some natives that are expanding their range a little bit. So that would be kind of some of the things to keep an eye on. And I'll show you that. If you're really interested in just native plants, very specifically native plants on a historical context, then some of the Native Plant Encyclopedia from the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources is a great resource. And again, I will show you that. If you're kind of more interested in general info, the Woody Plant Catalog from our Urban Forestry Center and on campus, in the St. Paul campus, is also kind of a fun resource to take a look at. And then another one, a large part of our southern Minnesota has been, and you may or may not be aware that a lot of our growing zone has changed from zone 4 to zone 5, at least in my area. So some of these resources that you might see in northern Iowa, like this Relief Master Tree List, could be applicable. And this comes from a nonprofit called Trees Forever. They also worked with the city of Cedar Rapids. So this was conducted after the terrible derecho that happened a few years ago in Iowa, where it was basically an inland hurricane. So you had 100 miles an hour plus winds. A lot of trees were taken out. And then shortly after, you had emerald ash borer kind of ravage the area even more. So they had to kind of really put in a massive plan into place for Cedar Rapids, but the resources that were made for it could apply to some of our southern Minnesota cities that are in Zone 5. Again, it's urban forestry focused, so it's not as woodland focused as some of these other ones, but again, a very great resource. So here's kind of an excerpt of Climate Ready Woodlands from University of Minnesota Extension. They kind of broke it down into these regions right here. And this particular one should be the Anoka Sandplain, Big Woods, St. Paul area. So this 7 here. And one of the resources I like, and I like any tree resource that has this, is they'll have the common name and the scientific name, but they'll also have the height and the width. And I think the width is also very important. So when you're doing your plan, particularly if you want to use these as residential trees instead of woodland trees, that width is going to come into play a lot. So when you're doing your plan, if these trees become mature, making sure that you're not crowding things or having these trees interact with power lines or neighbors' houses, etc. Always check to make sure that they have width somewhere. Height is great too, but width is also very important. There also be comments about soil requirements. A good one, a lot of trees here will be evenly moist, right, or well drained, but some of them will be adaptable to a lot of different soil types. Silver maple, cottonwood are examples. Hackberry, we'll talk a little bit about that later. The light requirements are also extremely important. It's a lot of these will be full sun or part shade. And then I think most of our shrubs and some of them will be more shade tolerant. But again, this is a great quick and dirty research or paper that's backed up by some of the climate modeling. And you can notice one of them is not commonly planted in our area, and that would be sycamore. If you go down to Iowa, you will see way more sycamores in residential landscapes and woodlands. But you can see some of the influence of these modeling, the climate modeling with that introduction. So that would have been one you may not have seen in previous recommendations. Now, here is the Native Plant Encyclopedia from the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. It's actually kind of hidden. I wish they would make this a little bit more easy to find. But originally, it was under Restore Your Shore, which was kind of uh, a good resource for lakeshore areas. But they also had this Native Plant Encyclopedia that was incorporated into it. So it doesn't only have aquatic or transitional areas, but it also has the upland areas as well. And you can select trees and shrubs. You can select your counties. So I kind of tried to pick sort of the types of counties maybe that we're dealing with here. And then you can also get this nice list. And it does provide all of that good information, give some spacing recommendations, heights, even flower color or bloom time if that's important, especially if you're doing things for pollinators. It doesn't have all the information for everything. Like basswoods certainly have bloom times and flower colors. But again, this is going to be very native focused, and some of these trees will be harder to find as a result. You're not going to be able to necessarily find this at a big box store or a tree nursery in your local area or even your SWCD tree sale. So that's kind of another negative. You might see all these really cool native species, but where can you get them, right? It's could be a little bit more difficult. And the woody plant catalog from the Urban Forestry Outreach and Research. So this is again a really great kind of general resource. Does give you those width and heights as well as the hardiness zone for a lot of trees, not just natives, but also introduced species as well. And again, they talk not just about the common characteristics, but they do talk about where you would find it on the landscape. And it can also give you some ideas about it on your residential area. It's not a huge exhaustive list, but it does have some good pictures and other types of information. Again, a good general resource. And lastly, here is that Cedar Rapids resource, the Relief Master Tree List. So again, this is very focused on urban situations. And they do have different types of classifications that they break down their tree recommendations in. So the ones that provide the most amount of food for wildlife, they're native and they're adaptable. They would probably be put under this superior bracket. But the thing I really like about the Relief tree list from Forever is that they have the height and width information here, kind of in relative terms, which is a little of a detriment. But you have things like the shape of the tree, the canopy, the relative speed of how they would grow. So you'll see a lot of our white oak groups, or a lot of our oaks in general, would be on the slower end of the growth scale, and that's not unusual. A lot of oaks love to put a lot of energy into protecting themselves as they grow. That might come at the expense of energy, but you do see some exceptions. So the red oaks tend to grow much faster than some of these bur oaks, for example. Some of them also have fall color that are described in this tree list, whether they have a conspicuous flower or not. Food for wildlife. Again, the ones that would, most of those oaks would have plenty of food for wildlife and they would score higher. But they also have this nice little site and soil list here where they'll talk about whether, the swamp oak would be fine in a forest, a park, a yard. But if it was in a parking lot, maybe not so great. If it was under utility lines, probably not. But it does talk more about the soils. You could see that swamp white oak does well in a lot of different soils, but maybe not as great with its compaction, where you would look at something like, you know, cottonwood would be better. And then they also add some other notes about some of the pros and cons, right? So even though the cottonwood would be great, you really want to keep it to naturalized areas, okay? Because cottonwood has its pros and cons. Let's just say that. For whatever you do, though, on your landscape, in your woodlands, we really want to try to avoid monocultures. What I mean by that is having one type of species or one type of genus into your landscape. So I want somebody to kind of put a chat. What are these trees? I want to see if anyone has a guess of what these are two of the same type of tree. What type of tree is this, you think? It was probably one of the first monoculture issues we've had. Yes, great. You guys got it already. So this is elm. This is American elm. The Dutch elm disease often has this kind of flagging feature where the elm would show kind of this issue, and then soon it would spread and kill the whole canopy. But you would always hear stories of people talking about cathedrals of elm trees, and that's certainly true here. But we lost many of those. And now, what do you think this is? This is in Toledo, Ohio, in the 2000s. What type of tree do you think this is? This is the next one. Seems like something maybe was pecking at this. I don't know. See some little blonde spots on the bark here. What do you guys think this is? What species? Yeah, Danielle got it. It is ash trees. Yeah, so we're running into the same issue with a lot of municipalities where they're kind of coming to terms with putting everything in a very similar genetic basis. So we see these ash trees, green ash particularly, getting wiped out by emerald ash borer, an invasive insect. So as we do our plans, a lot of the things that we've noticed in extension and then other agencies as well is people really like to plant maples. And I'm kind of picking on maples. I picked some pictures that me and my colleagues have taken over the years regarding a type of maple called a Freeman maple, which is a cross between a silver and a red maple. So these are your kind of autumn blaze type maples. We see a lot of people picking these on the landscape. And um, provided that you plant it correctly, and I don't think any of these were planted correctly, if you plant it correctly and take care of it, you should be okay. However, having nothing but maples on your landscape is kind of inviting some of those issues to come to the fore. People like maples because of the fall color. A lot of them grow very fast. They do have some diseases, but not too many. But if we have lots and lots and lots of maples being put on the landscape, you can never predict the future. And we do know there's at least one pest that can cause kind of emerald ash borer like damage to not just maples, but maples are one of their prime food, is the Asian longhorn beetle. And thankfully, we don't have, to my knowledge, we don't have anything here in Minnesota, but that would be an example of something that could get into our area, completely devastate maples. And if you have nothing but maples on the landscape, we're falling into that same trap again that we had with elms and ashes. So please, please switch it up. Just as important as picking the right tree is picking the right site for that tree. So a couple of things that I want you to think about if you're in a residential setting particularly is, are you in a shadier area or are you in a sunny area? Are you open to the wind or not? Are you clayey soils or do you have sandy soils? Is your pH high or low? And would you run into any issues with power lines or houses or anything of that nature? The one that I see people tend to ignore the most, but also has some really powerful impacts, is this pH right here. There are some species that people will plant, particularly pin oaks and certain types of birches, where a lot of our residential areas do have higher pHs. And those plants tend to show chlorosis. So you might see them turn yellow very early in the year. And that's a sign that the pH is typically too high for them. That doesn't mean that they'll die immediately or anything like that, but it does mean they'll be under stress. The plants are not used to a really alkaline or high pH environment. It's harder for them to take out certain nutrients from the soil, and it'll show as all yellowy leaves typically. So make sure you know this, and we can use a soil test to do this. And I'll talk a little bit about it, but that's the one that I see quite often in these types of environments where people don't know the pH and they plant a pH sensitive tree. So a couple selections, I could spend probably 2 hours talking about different types of trees, but I'm just going to bring up a few here that are relatively adaptable to quite a bit of different areas. But I do want to mention that every tree has a weakness and strengths. Okay, every tree has weaknesses and strengths. There is no one best tree for everything. And I'll try to go through some of the weaknesses if I do remember a notable one. So, for example, the shagbark hickory is great for kind of little shadier areas. The one issue with shagbark hickory is it can be kind of hard to find in nursery trades. One of the reason is that this particular type of species of hickory has a taproot, and a lot of times it can be kind of difficult to propagate it on a large scale and transplant it very well. But if you can get it onto your landscape, it has this beautiful exfoliating bark. It does have edible nuts, and it does have, in my opinion, has a really nice fall color. With swamp white oak, it does grow a little slower. Again, the swamp is kind of a misnomer. It does like it a little more moist, but it doesn't mean like you would plant it in the middle of a swamp. It is a white oak, so it provides some resistance to things like oak wilt that red oaks tend to be very susceptible to. And again, it has nice oak leaves. It's usually a pretty healthy tree. And you'll find this very commonly. I know in Mankato, there's quite a lot of white oaks, swamp white oaks being put up to kind of replace some of the ash trees that have been lost. But again, they can do well in these kind of part shade type areas. For clay soils, and we got plenty of clay soils down here in Mankato. And you'll see a lot of trees don't necessarily love clay soils, but some of these ones here that I chose can tolerate them. Okay. So one of the ones that, Emmy's favorite tree and probably one of my favorites too is hackberry. So this is a native tree. It's got a bark is really easy to kind of figure out whether it's a hackberry or not. It has something kind of akin to a warty kind of bark to it. Once you kind of get the picture of hackberry bark in your head, it can really help you with identification. The leaves are also kind of sandpapery and kind of rough. They do have fruit that is edible, but doesn't have too much onto it. But it's going to provide lots of habitat for different types of insects and provide some food sources for birds. One of the things, the weaknesses, there's a couple weaknesses with hackberry. One of which is it's not a really good compartmentalizer. So what that means is that if there's a really bad wound that happens, perhaps due to a storm or something else, and it gets rot inside the tree has a really hard time sealing it off and preventing it from spreading. So if you do have a rot issue in your hackberry, that could be more serious than it would be for something uh, like an oak. So that's kind of one of the weaknesses with hackberry. Another one that's kind of subjective is people think it's a ugly tree. A lot of times the leaves can get eaten by different types of insects. There are a couple mites that can cause some interesting growths up in the canopy, but it doesn't really hurt the tree. It's just one of those things where some people think, "Ooh, I don't want that." So again, a few weaknesses for the hackberry, but a very adaptable tree. I have it under here for clay soil tolerant, but it can go on a lot of different landscapes. And surprise, surprise, elm has made a comeback to some extent. As we're losing ash trees, uh, a lot of the places that ash trees thrived in, which was a lot of different types of soils, elms can thrive in that same exact spot. But in this case, we're going to be finding varieties of elm that are Dutch elm disease resistant. There is research being done at the University of Minnesota right now as we speak to find more types of resistant elms from survivor populations. I think maybe one in Mankato is in that system or in that experiment. But again, Dutch elm disease resistant elms are are more popular. You're probably going to have an easier time finding these in your local nursery. Hackberries, occasionally you'll see SWCDs carry them. Our Soil and Water Conservation District tree sales would have these. You could also find them in nurseries, but predominantly I see a lot of them in tree sales. So I mentioned high pH earlier when we were talking about pin oaks and birches, certain types of birches like river birch that really don't like those high pH or alkaline. If you find yourself in that situation, there's a couple of trees that also do okay with higher pH. So we have honey locust here and Kentucky coffee tree. Again, both of these are pretty common. They shouldn't be too hard to find. A lot of the residential honey locusts that you will find will be either thornless or thornless seedless. So a lot of times people will talk about messy trees, and honey locust usually gets put into that category. Although Kentucky coffee tree does have a very stout looking kind of bean, so to speak. The way you can tell between these two species is honey locust always tends to have a little bit of a twist, a little bit of an angle to it, and it tends to be a little longer than something like a Kentucky coffee tree. And then the other thing, of course, is if you're dealing with 100% wild native honey locust, is you're going to have some wicked thorns on it. So there's some funny theories about why honey locust evolved those types of thorns. One of which is that it was used to stop kind of big animals in the ice age from damaging it. But it's something to be aware of if you're going to have it in your woodland or your landscape. These can be quite sharp, and if you're dealing with wheels or equipment, or if you accidentally back up and hit one of those, I can tell you from firsthand experience, it is not fun. But the seed pods are a great wildlife attractant. So if you have this in your woodland, you have a lot of honey locust pods coming down on the ground. Lots of animals really love to eat honey locusts. I can think of squirrels as probably the number one. They have a really funny way of eating it. They can almost pop it out like uh, I, I don't know, like using bubble wrap or something. They're really good at it. So a lot of the things when we're talking about the right site, I'm biased. My background's in soil science, and I am also working for the University of Minnesota. So this is a double bias situation. But when we're dealing with site selection, getting a soil test, in my opinion, is very, very helpful. And in our situation, some of the things that you would look for, let's see if I can get this to right. So we have trees and shrubs. So this would be from the University of Minnesota. You would check which type of tree or shrub that you're thinking about putting in, broadly for evergreen. And, there's a lot of different tests here, and it can be very confusing. For general tree planting, there's only maybe one or two tests I would recommend. For most cases, if I know nothing else, a regular test is perfect. It'll tell you pretty much all you need to know. The texture kind of tells you a rough guess about how well drained or not your soil is, or how clayey, sandy it is. You will get fertilizer recommendations. I don't recommend fertilizer. Most of the time, trees don't need a lot of fertilizer. But if there's a recommendation, you'll get it from the university. You'll get that pH. Remember that I said a lot of people may not know the pH in their residential area or the residential soils. This test will give you that. So very important. And the organic matter is also important too. If you're dealing with a really low organic matter, you might have to add a little bit more fertilizer. It might change some of the species that you select. It could affect things like how much you need to water. But again, the only other test I would perhaps recommend is if you're really close to a roadway, or you're in some situation where you suspect there's a lot of salt being applied. In that case, a soluble salt test would be very useful. Usually, again, in those urban environments, you're kind of close to a road that's been salted regularly during the wintertime. You might see some dead grass kind of in that area year after year. Then that might call for some of that salt testing. And now we're going to kind of transition over to maintenance and planting. I want to kind of a throwback from the old days is you don't want to set it and forget it when you're talking about trees. So there was a famous infomercial back in the 90s where people were selling rotisserie chicken makers, and they would say, you just set it and forget it. Your Ronco type things. Please don't do this. Trees, you need to pay attention to your trees, especially if you're putting in a large amount of money into them. Getting the planting right is extremely important. I'm going to show a lot of photos from a certain area in Mankato. This place will be not described. I won't harp on it too much, but you will see lots of photos from around the same area. So if you're dealing with a large scale planting and you're doing it incorrectly, you're going to end up with some of these problems, especially later on, could be years down the road. So again, proper planting really, really, really matters. And I kind of broke it down into kind of the four things that I see a lot when people are planting trees that are kind of like, ooh, you don't want to do that. So this won't apply to all different types. I managed it, some will be containerized trees that some of these issues will be more common in, and then bare roots, like the ones you might get from a soil and water conservation district. There's also a couple of things that can go wrong. Other ones are kind of universal. And I'm going to mention, I'll have this in the resource guide, but I will tell you what, this tree owner's manual for the Midwestern United States from the Forest Service is like the best. If you had just one resource to have at home that can really walk you through all the maintenance, the planting, it would be this. I would highly, highly, highly recommend this. Read it, understand it, love it, and you'll be happy. So let's go with circling roots or girdling roots for our first issue. So how many times have people seen your circling roots like this when you pick it up from the big box store, maybe? Has anybody seen these types of roots before? Why don't you type it in the chat? You've seen kind of containerized trees that kind of look like that. Has anybody? Yep, some people are clapping. Yep, definitely. Yeah, so we deal with circling roots a lot, especially when you have big stores have tree sales. It's always worth it to kind of take a close look and make sure you're not running into this situation. Because eventually, as the tree is planted like this, these circling roots will turn into something called girdling roots, where the root is kind of growing in a circular or the wrong direction, quote unquote, and it's actually affecting the trunk itself. And when it gets really tight and starts to constrict that trunk, that can interrupt fluids and other types of minerals that the tree needs to be healthy. And you will see stuff that will look like it's in drought, like it's in drought damage, or there's a pH issue, but really it's coming from this girdling root that's strangling the tree. Okay. And then if the situation is bad enough, this can create kind of weak points at the tree. And then if you have something, a big storm that happens, those can be failure points or weak points. So again, something we want to try to avoid this. There are ways to kind of cure girdling roots if you know what you're doing. But if you let it go for decades and you're not paying attention, you can have something like this happen, where girdling roots were involved in a tree failure. So it's better to kind of nip it in the bud. And kind of one of the ways that our urban forestry and outreach center on campus really kind of uh, advocates is something called box cutting. So it's essentially taking about an inch or so inside the root ball and making kind of it into a box, from a circle to a box. And you can cut it, use saws that you don't care about. But essentially what you're doing is you're cutting those those potential girdling roots off and stimulating another flush of growth that will hopefully be in the right direction. So that's kind of a way to get it. If you do find yourself in that situation with a containerized tree, doing box cutting can be a really helpful strategy to kind of avoid some of those issues. So next we're going to go to something called J-rooting. And I see this a lot with bare roots, roots that are plants that you might get at the tree sale at your conservation district. And this is kind of what J-rooting looks like, if you've ever seen it. So essentially what it is that the hole was not deep enough for the whole root system, and it was kind of more or less jammed in. When that happens, you have roots kind of growing up into closer to the soil surface, which for a lot of species is not great. Once it comes into contact with air or other things like that, it can cause issues. So it's one of those things that is kind of more, you need to take your time when you're planting bare root transplants. And one of the things that I like to use, and this is a good resource from the University of Missouri, is use something called a dibble bar, which is kind of a neat little tool that allows you to quickly put in kind of bare root trees. But you'll notice that when this description of the growing, you want to make sure that the root system is kind of nice, in kind of not jammed, or so it would become a J root. So again, using a dibble bar is kind of a fun way to do this quickly, but always make sure you want to have good soil contact with the roots. You just don't want to have that J root situation where it's planted probably too deep, and or the root system is not in a position to succeed. This is another one I see mostly for containerized trees. So if you get a containerized tree, you're bringing it home, you're getting ready to plant it. A lot of times people will plant it almost like you're putting in a post in a fence. That's not what we want. When that plant gets put in there, you're having the roots go into an extremely hostile environment. Could be compacted. There could be a lot of issues going on. So when we do plant things, we want to make sure that it's 2 to 3 times the width of the container or root ball. And this will really help have a nice loose soil. So as the roots grow out, hopefully they can go into an environment that's a little nicer. If you're dealing with more clayey soils or really harder soils, you may want to even go further out to do so. And when you plant that tree in, you always want to make sure you do it at the proper depth. So you see this person right here is making sure that they're getting it at the root flare, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. But again, 2 to 3 times the width of the container root ball, that soil should be nice and mixed up and mashed up. One other thing I want to talk about with when you're doing your tree planting is not to put a load of stuff in it. Again, trees really don't need a lot of fertilizer. If you're putting tons of fertilizer in that planting hole, you're doing a couple things.
Shane, could
Yep,
you quickly, there's a couple questions in the
yep.
chat. If you could go back, they're asking if planting in a square hole versus round hole to discourage circling roots, and then if you could address whether how to remove cages, burlap when
Mhm.
planting a B&B tree.
Yeah, that's a good question about that. So in terms of square hole versus round hole, I would defer to the actual cutting of that root ball into a square. I guess I don't know if you're talking about the cutting aspect or planting it in a hole or square hole or round hole. I guess I'm not clear on that. Um, Creating the hole. I don't know if I know too much about the exact differences. I think as long as you're doing that 2 to 3 times the width, um, and you're making sure that you don't have the circling roots, whether by doing a box cutting method or just finding plants that don't have that, um, that that would be the biggest thing. Um, as far as the cages and burlap, I I do know, but I do want to double check before I tell you. So I I will do a quick. I don't know if Claire or Emmy could do a quick research. I think I know, but I do not want to lead you down the wrong hole. If you guys know that right away, you could type that in for Janelle. But the square hole, round hole, I'm not aware of the actual shape of the hole, if that makes a huge difference. I think it's more loosening the soil and making sure you're not having girdling roots. But good question about the balled and burlap. We'll we'll get you that. I just don't want to say something wrong on that. Um, and then lastly, but certainly not least, is the too deep or no root flare when you're planting trees. Extremely important. This is probably the one I see the most often not done correctly, and it will cause issues, not necessarily immediately, but often years and years ahead of time. So when people are talking about, well, the tree was perfectly fine, and then all of a sudden this happened, um, and you tell them that it was planted too deep, they usually don't believe you. But I will tell you that planting trees too deep is not a great idea for a couple of reasons. So one of the things that we want to make sure when we're planting a tree is that you want to see the topmost kind of structural slash woody root. Sometimes people will say it's a bulge or a root flare. You want to be able to see that. Show me your flare, you might see. It can be a little bit below the surface, but not by much. Sometimes people will use a surveyor's arrow just to kind of poke and see how deep they feel that topmost structural woody root. Um, and this is picture on the right is something that we don't want to see. So you might see people talk about telephone pole type tree plantings. That would be a great case of something that was likely planted too deep. Now, there are certain species that can handle this better than others. Things like ash trees and a few other ones can do better on this. But things that have typically thin bark really don't like being planted really, really deep. And if you're not sure kind of what a properly planted tree is, I would advise just going out to an old growth woods, someplace, some forest that's very old. And I want you to take a look around and see each of the species. You know, there might be maples there, there might be oaks there, there might be other types of species there that you're considering planting on your landscape. And if you're curious about what that bulge looks like or that flare looks like, nature rarely plants too deep. There are always exceptions, but most of the time when you're out there, the tree has kind of figured out its right depth, either through animals that have buried it or whether it grew naturally. And this is kind of another thing where if trunks are put way down below, a lot of times I will see issues of splitting, sun scalding. You will also get kind of girdling roots that kind of can also occur. Notice that I said the topmost structural root. So I'm not talking about very thin, kind of wispy roots. We really are talking about uh, making sure that that root flare is visible. Burying it too deep is a recipe for disaster.
Shane,
Yep.
before we get off this topic,
Yep.
there's just a question that you had a bullet regarding old feedlot soil can
Yep.
lead to trouble, and
Yep.
can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's probably a remnant of one of our earlier talks that I did. That's a good question. So that feedlot soil, it can be very odd. So the nutrient content on some of those old feedlot soils could be kind of out of whack. Um, there could be things like higher pH, really high phosphorus levels, really high, that could be salt content. There could be weird things going on. So if you have an old feedlot soil, making sure that you have a soil test can help rule out some of those issues. Hopefully that's clear. Again, some of these I've done with different audiences where it was more of odor control, wind breaks on farm properties, but good question. All right, so we're kind of getting near the tail end here, where we're going to talk a little bit about maintenance activities. So we did talk about planting, site selection. Now we got it properly planted. What can happen next? So, of course, probably one of the most important things this last few years was proper watering. The last few years we've had some really nasty droughts. We're still kind of in a drought now, even in the wintertime. So you can't skip this step. I think in previous years when we were in kind of that wet cycle, some people could get away with planting a large amount of trees and letting the natural rain kind of keep them fine. But as we've kind of approached these droughty issues and droughty situations, a lot of times we can't bank on that. So making sure that we're watering our trees properly should be required. Watering can be pretty complicated, though. We do have some good resources I will share with the university that kind of walks you through it. In general, and this changes between different extension agencies. Some people will say 1.5 gallons or 2 gallons per every caliper inch, and that's kind of like the little width of your tree. Daily for the first couple weeks. Then you start to space out the waterings, making sure that they're kind of nice and deep watering instead of very frequently. And then, of course, not ignoring weather when it does happen. That's another thing that tends to happen. So if it rains constantly for the whole week, you don't need to go out and rain again or water again. Or if your soil Hopefully you picked a plant that's the right type of, that matches well with the drainage that you have on your site. So again, don't ignore your soil and don't ignore weather when you're doing your watering regime. There's a lot of different ways that you can kind of do your watering. 5-gallon buckets are kind of probably the most common way I see around here. I do see other methods, kind of your water bags, your gator bags, your water diapers, your tree diapers, those types of situations where it slowly waters over time with your plants. They can be useful in larger scale situations where maybe a labor is an issue. And then you can kind of go old school with your hoses, whether you have a soaker hose, a garden hose, those types of irrigation methods. And there's more, but those are kind of the most important ones that you see. However, this is something that I noticed in that same stretch of road in Mankato that shall remain nameless. We saw a lot of water or tree diapers that have been applied to trees and kind of forgotten about. And then not only were they kind of forgotten about, they were hit with lawnmowers and other equipment. The trees that were in this row were probably not planted correctly anyway. And then when you add tree rings that are kind of neglected and also hit with equipment, it just kind of makes a big mess. So some of those tree diapers and tree bags, they have their own issues, but if you're in a pinch, they can be a really good resource. Just make sure that you're not abusing them accidentally. So this is an excerpt from our Watering Newly Planted Trees workshop, webpage, where it talks about the caliber of the tree trunk, about how many years that you would expect a tree to have its root established, where you wouldn't have to worry about this as much, and then gallons of water at each irrigation. So again, that 1.5, 1 to 1.5, 1 to 2 gallons per inch kind of rule. Again, there's some wiggle room there, but it can help you kind of get an idea of how much you're supposed to water. And it's something that is a good reference for the future. In rare cases, if you have an established tree, an older tree, and you're in a really severe or exceptional drought situation, it can be helpful to water them in some cases. We have information for that as well, where we're looking at how far the roots would spread from this mature tree, and that would be kind of the area you would irrigate or water. And then it's not necessarily the amount of gallons you won't find on here, but is the how wet is the soil 6 to 9 inches deep, and it should be moist after your irrigation. So this is kind of a and you can do this with other types of waterings with even with your younger trees, but this like 6 to 9 inch deep moisture is kind of a good way to tell without getting really in the weeds with certain number of gallons, XYZ. So now we're going to move quickly to weed control and mulch. So one of the things that people don't expect is that things like grass can really be a powerful competitor to young trees in terms of water. So making sure that you have a weed-free area around your trees, and in this case, it was a windbreak situation. 3 to 4 feet wide could be helpful in this case. Again, we want to try to make sure that we're maintaining our watering and making sure that these trees get a nice head start and that the grass or other types of plants and vegetation are not being super aggressive and taking away all of that stuff that this little baby tree needs to survive. Some farmers and some homeowners will use herbicides to kind of clear the turf area around the tree. There are pros and cons to that, of course. Some people will use tillage too. If you're doing a large scale kind of tree planting. The one thing I will tell you with the herbicides is read the label. It's the law. A lot of times there will be restrictions. There will be some of them are labeled for kind of tree plantations and things like that, but you still got to read it very closely. Certain species of trees may be affected more than others. Certain weeds might be affected more than others. So making sure you know that label back and front very well is required if you're going to go this route to control weeds. I will tell you that another thing that can help is it's not just the foliage that can take up herbicides. It is the bark or the trunk too in some cases. So if you're trying to do this type of technique, have a couple ways to protect that trunk if you're doing this type of application. That would be my kind of tip for you. It doesn't have to be very expensive or but something that can at least protect that trunk while you're doing that application, and then you can take it off depending on the product. Here's one that I enjoy seeing a lot, not really, is something called lawnmower blight, or as Gary Johnson, our emeritus professor, would say, this is the spouse disease, because it's never your fault. It's the spouse or significant other that it hit the tree with the lawnmower or the string trimmer. I see this a lot, particularly with those Freeman maples, those thin-barked maples, but you can see it on other types of species, of course. It's very stressful for the tree. In some cases, you get these big cankers that can form. It'll be an ugly wound that will restrict some of the nutrients that are going up. In some cases, having the mulch or some sort of visual barrier so that when you're moving that equipment, you're driving that equipment, you kind of have an area where, oh, I got to make sure I stay away from that mulch so I don't hit it. And that can also protect your tree kind of in the meantime. It's hard in some cases if you're doing a larger scale planting, but you really don't want to hit your tree with any type of equipment. Some of the other things that can be useful are organic mulches. I'm a big fan of organic mulches because they can break down. They often can help soil, particularly compacted soil. Other mulches can be used. The biggest thing with some of the plastic mulches and those types of deals is you really don't want to have it really tight around the trunk. That could interfere with growth. And you got to make sure that it's being inspected and that water and air can flow. And here's the no mulch volcanoes. You've seen that a lot. We get those kind of roots that can come out and start girdling. And then lastly is some of those animal protection. So winter protection. So you've got some tree wraps. The one thing I see people do a lot with trees is keep those wraps on the whole year. You really only need it for that fall winter area, and that's to help prevent sun scald or winter cracks. You can do things with conifers as well. But the one thing I will tell you with conifers is you want to make sure that they have plenty of water up until frost so that you can avoid some of the winter damage in the spring. For staking trees, I'm running out of time here. Most trees do not need stakes. This is kind of a big surprise to a lot of people. You really don't want to have the tree nice, rigid, and unmoving. You want to be able to build some caliper or build some strength in the wood over time. Most trees don't need stakes again. If you do use stakes, you want to make sure that it's flexible and wide straps, because you definitely don't want to have, again, this is the same stretch of road in Mankato. I'm picking on it bad, but it just had so many good examples of poor staking and poor planting. I just had to take photos. I'm sorry. But here's some other examples. That whole garden hose and wire, don't do that, please. A lot of times you can forget about it. It can cause girdling damage to trees. And then last, but certainly not least, we have our hungry trinity of tree-eating critters. Say that 10 times fast. We have our nice deer that can cause deer rub damage, and they can also eat twigs and other parts of succulent pieces of trees. We have our rabbits, and one of the things for rabbits is that it'll give you that nice 45-degree sharp, neat angle. And then we have our little vole, which tends to do damage underneath the snow line and can cause really bad damage, particularly to fruit trees, but a lot of trees that have thin bark too. The one thing I will tell you is that physical exclusion is often the best. It's what people don't want to hear, but that's the best strategy we have against these animals. There's no one weird trick. You can experiment with repellents. If you do repellents, we kind of focus more on the fear-based ones. And then, of course, our birds can also cause issues. So I think I ended right at 1, unfortunately. But I think, Emmy, you might have a few things to talk about through.
Yep.
SWCD?
Yep, I'm just going to talk quickly about some kosher and assistant areas, and then I believe, Shane, if you want to go through the chat, there's some
Yep.
questions. So really quickly, there is a lot of programs through Soil and Waters and NRCS, and one of the big ones is tree sales. He did talk about you can get, they're technically like stick trees, we like to call them. They're pretty small, but you can get them for pretty cheap, especially if you're doing a large planting. And all of them in this area in the cannon do have tree sales. I believe most of them are currently open. So please look at your local soil and water website to see about that sale. They also all offer windbreak planning and species selection. So if you don't know what species, you can call them. They can help you. If you want a windbreak, they can come out, see what your needs are, and help you plan that out for you. I'd say earlier the better. You don't want to try to do it, middle of winter or that spring. Maybe try to plan out ahead of time. And then NRCS also offers programs for tree planting and management for small and large scale areas through their CSP and EQIP program. Shane, if you want to go to the next slide. And then the DNR has some programs available. Currently, it's for tree plantings, forest improvement, health, wildlife enhancement, protection, riparian, and then forest recreation. And this is more little larger scale than like a single tree, but it is something that if you are interested to contact the local DNR forester, and they can kind of walk you through if you're eligible and help you with that. And they can also just answer general tree questions always too, even if it's like a single tree disease or something. They're more than willing to talk to you on the phone about that. And then there is, with EAB, it's becoming widespread. There is more programs coming available to help with that. DNR this past year had a grant for cities and soil and waters. They had a lot more applicants than they did money. So watch out, there could be more opportunities this way. And there also just more coming down the line in terms of urban forestry and I guess not just urban, but all forestry health. So just kind of watch out for that. Or if you're interested before you even do anything ever, I recommend contacting your local soil and water extension or DNR office. They could try to see if there is any programs for you available, and kind of try to connect you if there is or not. Doesn't hurt to always, like I said, if you're looking at doing anything, to reach out first to see. So.
Yeah, I think we have a couple questions here we'd answer quickly. Moving debris and firewood too late for ash, but let's keep our issues close to home and not share our pests. I would heartily agree with that. Thank you, James. I think we still get questions in my area, even though we have the quarantine and all the counties around us are quarantined. We always recommend folks use the firewood as close to where they got it as possible. And especially make sure you're not taking that stuff across counties that do not have EAB, of course. And then another question is about ash trees. We have a lot of ash trees on our property. Ash borer has been taking quite a few trees in town very close to our property. Do I wait for visible damage or tree failure before I replace them, or should I replace them soon? So Josh, if you are going to, do you want to do any type of treatment for these, or do you want to completely remove them? So if you want to remove them, it behooves you to do it sooner rather than later in a few cases. Why? If you wait until a tree is completely dead or hazardous, depending on your tree person, that could be dangerous and you could be charged more. So unfortunately, a lot of times you'll see ash trees removed when they're not super sick. And there's a good reason for that in a lot of cases. Treatment, have not heard good things about it. Yeah, there are caveats with treatment. So if you wait until the canopy is largely gone before you start your treatment, that is typically don't have great outcomes. Another thing with insecticide treatments for emerald ash borer, it's mostly preventative. The larger your tree is, you cannot do it once you get past 15-inch tree diameter. We really recommend having a professional typically inject an insecticide treatment, and we do know that those work pretty well. But you want to make sure you catch it early enough, and you'll have to reapply it every couple years or so. That's not an easy expense, but you'll have to kind of judge it based on some of those things we talked about earlier with the tree benefits, property values, heating and cooling costs, those types of things. But yeah, it's not a great situation. I wish I had better news. Yep. And
right.
any other questions? Yeah, I would say another thing on top of what Emmy said is our local extension educators, we're more than happy to help you out with your tree issues as well. Stop by, take a look. And I know that it's pretty tough here recently with lots of ash trees being lost, but we can certainly try to help you out.
All right, thank you. You will receive a resource list, like Shane mentioned, with many of the links that he mentioned today, and also his contact information. And like he said, feel free to contact me, Emmy, at Soil and Water as well. And you'll receive a follow-up email with that resource list and also a recording. And that'll come from Teresa DeMars at the Soil and Water Conservation District in Rice County. So make sure to open that when you get it. You'll get the recording and a resource list. And thanks, be in touch. We hope that we'll see you at future webinars.
Thanks, everyone, and thanks, Shane.
Yep, thank you.